Hi, I'm James with Mill Cove Woodworks, and today I want to show you how to make an edge grain cutting board using only your miter saw and a table saw. So for me, making an edge grain cutting board has always been a little intimidating. You see a lot of videos out there of woodworkers who will pull scrap pieces of cherry and walnut and things like that out of their cutoff pile, and then they can mill those together to make some beautiful cutting boards, but they have more tools than your typical woodworker, specifically a planer. So I wanted to try and figure out how I can avoid, number one, not having a surplus amount of cutoff boards, and number two, not using a planer. And I think I've come up with a pretty good idea that I want to share with you guys. So these are 3/4 inch by 3 inch pieces of S4S lumber that I purchased from Rockler. So I've got 3 pieces of cherry, 3 pieces of walnut, each of them are 2 feet long. And my idea is here to cut the pieces in half and then rip them so that we're left with a board that's 1 3/8 inches tall. And then once these are glued and put together, you'll have a board that's about 12 inches by 18 inches. And my hope here is that by ripping each of these boards on the table saw to that 1 3/8 inch, we're not going to need the planer to finish off that top edge. So first thing we need to do, of course, is go ahead and cut these down to 12 inch from 24 inch. So let's start with that. Later in the process, we are going to trim the edges of the cutting board. So these 12-inch cuts don't have to be precise, but the closer you can get them to all matching, the easier it's going to be for that trim up, and the more board you're actually going to save once you've glued everything together. Okay, so now that we've made our cuts to turn our 6 boards into 12 boards, we now need to figure out a way to rip these so that they all come out at the same height. Now, if these were perfect 3-inch boards, there wouldn't be much to it. You could just find center, rip down the edge, and then you should be left with 2 strips that are equally sized. However, there is at least one board in particular that stands about a 1/16 of an inch proud of the other boards. That's this one here. So if we were to rip this down the center and use the same approach for this one, then when we're done, this board is going to sit higher than these other boards. And again, the goal here is to avoid having to use a planer. So what I've decided to do is take these on the table saw and rip them to 1 3/8 inch. The idea being that the thickness of my blade, or the kerf, is 1/8 of an inch. So that will take out essentially 1.5 inches of the board, and that will then leave me enough to take the remaining piece, rip that down to, again, that 1 3/8 inch size. So when we're done, these 12 boards should be 24 boards that are all exactly 3/4 of an inch by 1 3/8 of an inch. And again, if we can do that, and if it works out, then we can avoid the need of having a planer. So let's see how it goes. Once you've confirmed that your table saw is set up for the 1 3/8 inch cut, you can go ahead and rip all 24 strips. And since this is eventually going to be the height of the cutting board itself, and this is going to be the finished edge that we're having to work down without a planer, you want to make sure that you take your time and make these cuts as precise as possible. Okay, so now that we have chopped the boards in half to a 12 inch and then ripped each of those to a 1 3/8 inch, we have 24 sticks ready for glue up. So the next step for me is going to be to organize these in a pattern that I think is appealing to me. I'm probably not going to go alternating 1 to 1. I actually think this walnut has a much prettier color to it. The cherry that I got from Rockler, to be honest, I'm a little disappointed. The coloring isn't quite what I was expecting. Some of the boards look better than others, but regardless. So now we're going to lay out the plan And then once we do that, we can start the glue up.
And there's no wrong or right way to how you arrange the sticks for your cutting board. Personally, as I mentioned, I think that the alternating cherry walnut just looks a little boring. So I'm adding a little bit more variety in how those are kind of grouped together. And also the cherry had a little bit of inconsistency in the coloring. So those lighter boards I'm trying to put together from the darker boards. But the goal here is just to have a nice consistent look that suits your personal preference. With the arrangement complete, we can now move forward to the glue up. And as you can see, I'm using Titebond 3 as it is water resistant. And you want to add a pretty healthy amount of glue onto the boards. And I used a foam brush to spread that out, which I realized after the fact was probably not the best approach. The foam tended to soak up a lot of that glue and get gummed up, so a silicone brush would have been a better approach, or even your finger. Once the glue has been applied, we can go ahead and start the clamping process. Now I am using 2 parallel clamps, as you can see, which will hopefully give me a nice flush bottom of the cutting board. And I'm trying to get those boards arranged as evenly as I can, but again, like I mentioned before, we are going to trim the edges, so that doesn't have to be perfect. And then I'm adding a pipe clamp to the top of the board just to help distribute where that pressure is coming in, which will help avoid any warping of the board, and again, give us that nice flush bottom.
So good news, bad news. The good news is the board has been set overnight, glue has set up, and we're ready to move on to the next step. Bad news is somebody forgot to hit record on that initial video of pulling out of the clamps and also kind of cleaning up the bottom edge of the board. So I've already worked this with a hand plane. It really wasn't anything too exciting in that. The bottom did come out pretty flush, obviously, with the parallel clamps. So didn't miss too much. Really, the heart of what we want to look at is finishing the top of the board. So in order to do that, I'm going to need to call in an old friend of mine because my newer workbench here is not equipped with any type of clamps. Now this little workbench is probably one of the oldest tools, I guess if you want to call it that I have in my garage. It is far from fancy, far from nice or expensive, but this thing has been pretty reliable to me over the years, so she ain't much to look at, but she'll get the job done.
At this point, I did have some boards that were sitting quite a bit proud of the others, so that's why I'm coming in with a hand plane, just to knock down a little bit of that height to make the sanding process easier. But when your glue up is complete, if you feel like those boards are pretty flush and even across the length of the board, then you could skip this process, but for me it was just going to save a lot of time and sanding. So now we're finally ready to trim the edges of that cutting board, and this is the point in the process where I really wished that I had a crosscut sled, because using this miter gauge for the table saw is not an ideal solution. It's really not made for an 18-inch cut like this, but it did get the job done, and if you don't have a crosscut sled, you can get by without it, but it definitely would have made life a lot easier for me. With the edges cut, we're now ready to give a finished edge to the top of that board. And if you don't have a router, you can certainly get by with just hand sanding the corners or the edges to kind of cut the sharpness. But I did have one available, so I went ahead and put on a rounding bit and ran that around the length of the board just to give it a nice polished finish. And now we're ready for the initial kind of first phase of sanding. And for this, I'm hitting it with an orbital sander using a 100 grit, a 150, and a 180. There will be some additional kind of finish sanding later in the process, but this gives us a nice starting point to work with. And then once I've hit it with the orbital sander, I come back with some hand sanding just around the edges to make sure that those routed edges are still clean, and also to kind of cut the corners on the bottom of the board. And with the first phase of the sanding complete, we can now move to the next step in the process, which is raising the grain. And for that, I'm just soaking the board pretty heavily with water, and this will help raise the grain so that when we get to the actual finishing using the mineral oil, we're not left with a kind of fuzzy feeling to the board itself. And then once it's dry, we can come back with our orbital sander. And for this, I'm using a 220 grit just to give it a very clean finish. And I will then come back and do a light hand sanding with a 300 grit. So when we're done, we should be left with a board that is buttery smooth and ready to start the finishing process. So now it's the moment we've all been waiting for, the finishing. And for that, I'm using some food grade mineral oil. And this is the most gratifying part of the process, because once you start putting this on, you can really see the color come alive in this wood. And I'll do a couple of coats with this. The first one I'm putting on pretty heavily. You want to make sure that every square inch of that board is covered with the mineral oil. And I'll usually let this sit for a little while, give it time to soak in, and then I'll come back in with a second treatment just to really ensure that the board is treated properly. And once the mineral oil has had time to kind of set, I like to come back with a mixture of mineral oil and beeswax. I feel like this just gives the board a little bit of a sheen and better protection. And also, once this board has been put into use for a while, you can use the same formula to kind of rejuvenate the board and keep it from drying out. Now this is a mixture that I've made myself using 4 parts mineral oil and 1 part beeswax. You can also buy off-the-shelf conditioners that will give you the same effect. But for the life of the board, this is really going to be kind of what keeps it alive and looking as good as it does right now.
Okay, so cutting board is now done. And the overall process, without having a planer, it's not that bad. If you have a planer, obviously use it. But if you don't, if you're a beginner woodworker, hobbyist, or you're just kind of building up your tool base and you don't have a planer, don't let that keep you from making a cutting board. I know up until now it always has for me, but this process works. It's not perfect, but it does work, and I think it, end result, is really nice. So if you have any questions, comments, feel free to leave them below. Otherwise, thanks for watching, guys.